So this week's sin is Sloth, Acedia. I said right at the start of this lecture series that this was, for me, the most enigmatic of the sins. And why is that the case? There are two things, really. On the one hand, what even is this sin? I think with the other sins, okay, envy is a little bit complex, pride is fairly complex, but I think we can grasp it pretty quickly. With sloth, there's not even a word that accurately gets across what this is. Sloth is the translation that has been preferred in English since the early modern period, I think. But this word itself doesn't really capture what we're going to be talking about today. What we're going to be talking about today is a certain kind of affliction for which there is no word. We might choose a word like depression. We might choose a word like boredom. We might choose a word like misery. We might choose a word like dejection, melancholia. I don't know what word we choose, but I know that all of them, there's a problematic question beneath them. How is that a sin? If I tell you that for the Middle Ages, depression was a sin, what does that mean in any meaningful way? If you remember, our definitions of sin were to choose to do something against your better interests. Well, you could rightly shout at me that no one chooses to be depressed. I don't choose to be bored. It happens. It's terrible when it happens. I don't necessarily choose to despair or deject. So I think this is going to be one of the problems. Another part that makes this enigmatic is this issue of doing things, action and inaction. For all of the other sins that we've seen, really it's something like doing something that makes the sin, isn't it? With pride, we're actively saying, well, I want to put my interests first. And you do so through your actions, your hubristic actions. Envy, more so. We spread the slander or whatever. Anger speaks for itself, a fit of rage. And avarice and gluttony and lust are all about the action themselves. But sloth seems to be, at least, about inaction, about when given the opportunity to do something, doing nothing. So it's not enough to live a full life and never really do anything. You're still a sinner by some accounts. We need to understand what this means. Is it really doing nothing that's the problem? Is it just getting up in the morning and doing nothing, which does happen to all of us, every now and then? Is that the problem here? Or is it something wrong, apparently wrong, judged to be sinful, in the choice to do nothing? Is there a distinction between choosing to do nothing and doing nothing because you just could not face doing anything? Don't worry, these questions and others will be answered, hopefully, in this lecture. So there are four things we're going to look at. First of all, obviously we have to get to the heart of the problem. What is Acedia? This is the word that's been used. It's a Greek borrowing. It's been used since the very first writings on the seven deadly sins. Evagrius Ponticus uses this word, called writing in Greek, and then Cassian chooses to repeat that word in Latin, and it's stuck. What is Acedia? What do we understand by this sloth, this Acedia? So we need to get to the bottom of this, and through exploring Acedia in different ways, we're going to start to see some strange patterns that recur, which I'm going to represent with a number of Ds. Coincidentally, they all begin with D, these patterns. Maybe you can find some other Ds. So we're going to explore what is Acedia, and that should take up most of our time, I suppose, a good bit of our time. World-Weariness, I'm going to explore after that. We're going to spin on into the early modern period. We're going to take a really brief look at Hamlet, Shakespeare's play, which is precisely about inaction in the face of action. Hamlet's supposed to commit revenge. He knows he needs to avenge his father because his father's ghost appeared to him and told him to take revenge, and yet Hamlet can't bring himself to do it. He is a classic melancholic or slothful figure or Acedia figure, without being lazy, but being melancholic. And we're going to analyse two speeches. I'm going to show you videos of two versions of the same speech, and we're going to discuss that. Then we're going to move on to depression, a difficult topic. Very, very difficult topic. We won't spend an awful lot of time on this, but it will be an interesting case study in how the pathologization of this sin of Acedia, this problem of not wanting to do anything, of choosing not to enter into the world of life and action, we can see how that's pathologized or treated in the modern world, if it is pathologized? Is it a sin? Maybe not. Is it a problem? Very much so. I'm sure you know that depression is the medical condition suffered by the most people in the world. It is the most populous medical problem. So we need to look at that. And finally, if you're not bored by then, we can analyse boredom itself, which, does it sound boring or not? Actually, you can get more laughs analysing boredom than analysing laughter, as I discovered in that achingly long 8-week lecture series on laughter last quarter. We will look at boredom, and we'll talk about Heidegger and maybe just a little bit of video games as well. We'll see. All right, so let's start then at the beginning. We've been here before. We've been to this desert. This is the Egyptian desert, isn't it? This is just outside Alexandria. This is Kelia. These are the early Christian monastic sites, as you can see now, archaeological remnants of what were monastic communities. And we know, because we've talked about this right in the very first lecture, that this is where the 7 deadly sins were born as a concept in Evagrius Ponticus's 8 generic thoughts. Let's remind ourselves of what he says about Acedia. Because for him, he actually devotes the most amount of his time talking about this one, what he calls the noonday demon. The demon of Acedia, which is also called the noonday demon, is the most burdensome of all the demons. Most burdensome. First, it makes the sun seem to slow down or stop moving, so that the day appears to be 50 hours long. Then it makes the monk keep looking out of the window and forces him to go bounding out of his cell, to examine the sun to see how much longer it is to 3 o'clock, and to look around in all directions in case any of his brothers are there. Guys, you know the feeling, I'm sure. You've been in this situation so many times. If this is not you writing essays, this is definitely me making a PowerPoint presentation. I definitely do all of these things. But, it's interesting to note that this is where it begins. It begins with a nervous distraction, a sort of a restlessness. It doesn't begin with any poisonous thoughts. It doesn't begin with anything like that. It begins with just a simple, like Bernard of Clairvaux's pride, which is a little curiosity. Oh, I wonder, what is the time? Then it makes the monk hate the place and his way of life and his manual work. It makes him think that there is no charity left among the brothers. No one is going to come and visit him. It makes him desire other places where he can easily find all that he needs and practice an easier, more convenient craft. So it employs, as they say, every possible means to move the monk to abandon his cell and give up the race. Okay, so this is what comes after that little bit of curiosity. You start to hate. You start to hate your situation. Again, you can imagine yourself writing the paper, oh God, why did I choose this? Why this class? Why this topic? And then, it's interesting that kind of, so you hate the work itself, you lose interest in the task that you're doing. That's important. But then why? It's this interesting shift, thinking that there is no charity left among your brothers, no one is going to come and visit you. It's an interesting pivot there from resenting your work that you're doing to suddenly resenting other people. It's a strange little pivot. I don't quite see the logic, but it's interesting. It makes you desire other places, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so distraction. And then finally, this is interesting, no other demon follows immediately after this one, but after its struggle, the soul is taken over by a peaceful condition and by unspeakable joy. Okay, there's a lot going on in this one. There's a lot going on. Where's the sin in all of this? It's hard to see a deadly sin. But of course, remember, for Evagrius Ponticus, these are not really deadly sins at all. They are generic thoughts, tempting thoughts. So, okay, it's interesting. I mean, maybe there's some sin you can see in hating your brothers, but really, it wasn't that. It was much milder than that. It was just resenting them for not visiting you at this particular moment. It's this unspeakable joy that we're going to return to throughout this lecture, because it is curious. And some of the best writers on depression, in preparation for this lecture, I listened to a lot of lectures on depression, and it's harrowing stuff, harrowing descriptions from clinical experts and from philosophers of depression. But most of these guys do talk about, at the end of depression, this other radiant possibility of grabbing life by both shoulders, and making something. So this unspeakable joy we will return to. Heidegger talks about it in Boredom too. Okay, so that's Evagrius Ponticus, writing in Greek, in the desert. It doesn't seem that bad. It's just a little bit of distraction. Makes you hate some people for a while, makes you hate your situation for a while, leads to unspeakable joy. Cassian advances this a bit more. Here's, by the way, a depiction of that desert community. Here are the monks. It doesn't look that boring, does it? Anyway, this is Fra Angelico in 1420, who never went anywhere near the desert. Let's hear Cassian. Our sixth combat is with what the Greeks call Acedia, which we may term weariness or distress of heart. This is akin to dejection. Okay. Distress of heart. There was no heart, I don't think, for Evagrius. It was implicit, but now we're getting a little bit more specific. Notice too that it's a combat now. It's a combat for Cassian. It's military. It's fighting something. Okay. When this has taken possession of some unhappy soul, it produces dislike of the place, just like Evagrius, disgust with the cell, just like Evagrius, although notice that word disgust. We'll return to that later. And disdain and contempt of the brethren who dwell with him, as if they were careless or unspiritual. Okay, same as Evagrius, but he seems to have added this other element of judging your brothers for not being spiritual enough, which is interesting. So it's not just doubting yourself and wishing you had distraction, it's also doubting others, which is interesting here with Cassian. The problem seems to spread out from yourself to the community around you in an interesting way. And so the soldier of Christ becomes a runaway from his service and a deserter, and entangles himself in secular business without at all pleasing him to whom he engaged himself. Right, now here's where we get somewhere really interesting, and this is going to be, I think, fairly explosive if we connect this with the modern idea of depression, or at least a few of us are going to get upset, including me, because what is this idea that in Acedia, in a moment of dejection and despair, you are in fact deserting your duty, you're running away from something. So this is, and notice the military metaphor comes back here. He'd said, oh, we're fighting, our combat is with Acedia. But now the military metaphor extends to deserting your duty. Soldiers who run away from battle, is there anything worse in the military than a soldier who deserts in battle? I think it's pretty much the worst thing you can do, isn't it, if you're in the military? In the First World War, people were shot for leaving battle when they really needed the soldiers. So that metaphor then is quite interesting. This idea of deserting, a runaway, deserter, going away from your duty. So that's Evagrius and Cassian. We get a fairly rich view of Acedia from these two writers. They're not the last writers on Acedia, we will look at others, but they set the tone, and everybody is referring to them later on, including Gregory the Great, who of course gives us the canonical 7. What patterns do we see? What can we explore? I have 5, yes it is 5, I have 5 Ds. Maybe you can guess the 5 Ds. Maybe internally imagine what my 5 words beginning with D are that are going to appear. Disgust. I think I left disgust off. Right, okay, that should have been 6. Dimitri, that's not one of the Ds. Can you think of a D? Okay. Depression, death. Okay, you've all come up with, doubt might be the only one, you've all come up with excellent Ds that I didn't include. This is good. All right, so, actually some of them I included. Okay, so distraction, number 1, D. Distraction, that seems to be important here. Distraction. Pretty mild, isn't it? It's pretty mild. What is distraction after all? What is distraction after all? I think there's a good theory of distraction that there's no such thing as distraction, in the sense that who prioritizes what you should focus on and what you shouldn't. If an animal was eating something and then decides to, make a nest, we don't say, oh, it was distracted from eating that frog, and now it's making... I don't think we would use that phrase. I'm not a biologist. But okay, so distraction seems to be important here, this idea that you should have been doing something you didn't. Doubt in self and others. Mariam, you did say doubt. And demon, you did. In fact, you said most of the Ds. Doubt is important too, isn't it? Doubt is a lot more serious in the Christian tradition. We have St. Thomas, one of Jesus' apostles, I think, who doubted him. Is he doubting Thomas? Doubt. There's an excellent movie called Doubt, actually, which is with Philip Seymour Hoffman, which explores the theological nature of doubt. But basically, this comes down to a root core aspect of your faith. Do I really believe this stuff? You're sitting in your cell, you're in the Egyptian desert. Do I really believe in it? You're sitting at your computer, you're writing your essay about envy. Do I really believe in it? It's doubt, unfortunately. Although remember, it's the others too that's quite intriguing here. Demons come up again and again. How significant is that? How seriously should we take it? It's a noonday demon, as Cassian calls it. Should we take that seriously? Does he really think that a demon has come? It's very important, isn't it? Because then it wouldn't really be your sin, would it, if you'd been possessed by a demon? Would it not be your possession? Would it not be you rendered as not agent in your own actions? A demon came. Think of it seriously. And of course, it's one of the metaphors that I would use to describe depression today. I prefer the metaphor, it's a demon at some level, because it can be fought. You can externalize it. You don't have to give an explanation, which is, I made a choice. You can say, sometimes these things just come. How seriously should we take the demons? Deserting a duty, that's the novel one. I think you did say deserter, maybe. And duty is another D, of course. This is, as I say, we need to follow it through. How much of Acedia is about not just being distracted from something, but choosing to turn away from your duty? Do we have a duty? Now, if we think about this in terms of depression, I don't know, but it could be interesting. Do you have a duty to others? Do you have a duty to be somebody in society? Is depression turning away from that? Is that insulting to say that's what's happening in depression? I might be upset if I heard that and I was depressed and you said, you can't be depressed, you're deserting on your duty. You need to be strong for your family, or you need to be strong for your students. I might say, well, don't blame me, it's a demon, or something like that. And finally, delight somehow follows. Delight, this joy, this what did Cassian call it? Unspeakable joy. Yes, we need to follow that through. Is it real? Is it a real idea? Is it a real idea that Acedia is a prelude to the highest of the joys? Unspeakable joy in God or in whatever. Okay, so let's follow these through. First of all, I imagine you are, if you're anything like me, grappling with this, you're already saying, hang on a second, look, there's a problem here, because how are we going to distinguish any of these different kinds of sadness? Basically what I'm describing is a very vague form of sadness involving distraction, doubt, blah, 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 blah. But are there other forms of sadness? Say, for example, a parent dies and you're thrown into grief. Of course, this happens, unfortunately, in life. How do medieval thinkers classify that? Does that contribute to Acedia? Is it part of it? Can it be separated from Acedia in any meaningful way? Are you derelicting your duty to be a strong family person, Christian person, if you're in grief? Hardly seems fair, does it? Melancholia, where does that fit in? So I've made this brief bar chart, or whatever no, not a bar chart, it's definitely not a bar chart. I've made this 3-column diagram to try and explain, based on reading several different medieval writers. This is not perfect, there are problems, and as you can see there's at least one question mark which we need to go deeper into. But let's say we have, on the one hand, it should be luctus actually, I've put it in the accusative for no reason. Luctum, grief, this is grief, okay, in medieval texts. We have melancholia, discussed as a condition involving the bile or the humours of the body, and Acedia. Okay, so grief then. Grief, and I would say that this is quite important in a lot of texts. I was just reading just this week a manuscript on the 7 deadly sins where there's a description that you're going to build the heavenly Jerusalem on earth by fighting the 7 deadly sins one by one. And there's this problem because they say, well, you need to fight Acedia by being joyful all the time, spiritually, outwardly joyful. But at the same time, the text falls over itself. But it says, but we also need to remember that joy is a bit of a problem because it says in the Gospels, woe to you who are joyful now because you'll come to mourn. Happy are those who mourn now, for you will come to be joyful in the afterlife. There's a sense in Christian theology that actually grief and suffering are important parts of a good Christian life because this world is imperfect and it's dominated by evil forces, people who sin, and that only God is perfect, and that actually this means that Christians suffer all the time. This is one of those problems in theology that we're definitely not going to solve right now. But definitely there's a sense of grief, sorrow, suffering. It's understandable. Job had to do it in the Old Testament. Job had to suffer over and over again, and he understood that suffering must be endured, and that what comes after suffering is eternal spiritual delight. Jesus suffers on the cross the most extreme way, and then comes to his happiness. Penance itself is about suffering in this life, maybe flogging yourself with a whip, as the flagellants did in the 14th century, or maybe just getting on your knees and giving yourself some really nasty bruises. But suffering, whichever way you conceive it, is often seen as a prelude to something joyful. So it can be, for a lot of these writers, luctus or grief, it's a spiritual response. It's a natural spiritual response. It's not a bad thing. Its cause is adversity, the natural adversity that you suffer being a good Christian in a bad world. Importantly, and this is the crucial part, guys, this is the crucial part of this, the will is present. You have the will. When you are grieving, you have the will to be well. You have the will to move forward with your life back to healing. Job understood that he must endure his sufferings. He didn't sort of despair. Well, he did a little bit despair, but it's important. This is not despair. You have not lost will. You have not lost hope with grief. Apparently. You or I may not experience grief like that in our lives, I have to say, but still, in theory for Christians, grief was something where the will retained intact. Melancholia then, this is much easier to distinguish because it is seen in pure medical terms as a biological phenomenon. Your humours are out of balance, you have too much black bile. We're going to come to this later in the second lecture. There's black bile in your body and it's bubbling up and it's making your blood turn bad. And it's getting into your brain and it's affecting your thoughts. Or possibly you've eaten too much cabbage, which also is another explanation. But whichever, this is melancholy. And unfortunately for some of us, statistically, a quarter of all of us, what is that, like 6 people in this room? That's us, I'm afraid. We just have blood like this. We just have humours like this. We are melancholics, according to medieval theory. So, it's a physical response. There's no question whether you chose this or not. We'll come to that a little bit later, probably, but there's no question whether you chose it or not. It's just your body, guys, unless you ate the cabbage, of course, then you did choose it. The cause is the bodily balance, as I say. The will is weak. It's a weak will that you have when you're a melancholic. Doesn't mean it's not there, it's just weaker. You need to work a little bit harder. It's a bit like, someone who doesn't like running on the treadmill. You're not as good a runner as others, but you're going to have to keep working at it. That's the idea here. It's unfortunate you were born with lots and lots of fast twitch muscles and no slow twitch muscles. You can't do a marathon very well, but you're going to have to work at it. That's the medieval theory here. A weakness, but it doesn't mean your will is not there. You're going to get on the treadmill, you're going to keep working towards spiritual joy. Unfortunately, guys, this is an incurable state, from what I can gather, for the melancholic. I don't think there's any remedy. Melancholic episodes can be fought, according to Galen, but I think if you're a melancholic soul, I'm really sorry, guys, it's just there. And finally then, Acedia. Okay, so it is a sinful response. It is sin. Acedia is sin, which, again, if we take some of these definitions we've been exploring, it could be that we choose it. So we need to understand that this is a choice at some level. When you're looking out the window and getting distracted and thinking about your brothers and starting to hate everyone and then not being bothered, it's a choice. Somewhere along that line, apparently, is a choice. When you're drifting off slowly during this lecture, you're choosing, apparently. Or alternatively, maybe we should remember Augustine's letter on anger, which was fascinating, which we've returned to many times, which talked about the sinful episode. The sinful moment was not becoming angry, but choosing to enjoy the anger. With envy, likewise, we saw a little bit of this, I think, in Lucian. It's not necessarily... the envy is bad in itself, but it's that moment where you start to enjoy, drip every enjoyment you can out of the slander. Criticism can be okay, but when you enjoy the criticism, are you going too far? So maybe part of the sin here that we need to accept is the moment at which, not that you start becoming a little bit distracted and looking out the window, or your eyes slowly drooping, the moment you allow yourself to enjoy that feeling. The cause, this is a problem, the cause, big problem. What causes Acedia then? Is it, because after all, you might just be in a really bad monastery, really bad abbot, terrible fellow brothers, always prattling on about inanities. you're going to get distracted. We'll see this later when we talk about Heidegger and boredom. You know, sometimes there are just boring things that happen, and you know. So, but there seems to be more. If Acedia is a spiritual, if it's like taking on a robe and wrapping it round yourself of your boredom, if that's what it is, if it's wrapping yourself in this sadness, then maybe we need to understand some other cause. And loss of love or lack of love in your heart might be the problem, I'm afraid to say. At least for one writer, at least for Dante. And you might remember last week's Otto Dick's representation of the 7 deadly sins. If you remember, envy was that little blonde-haired, Hitler-moustached sort of demon. Remember, Sloth was that enormous skeleton with a scythe with a massive hole here where his heart should have been. We'll look at that in a second. The will is abandoned in Acedia. That's the problem. You've lost the will. If you've really succumbed to Acedia, you do not want to get better. You do not want to get out of Acedia. You cannot be bothered even to do that. Dante does it brilliantly in his Purgatorio with Belacqua, this figure who's on Mount Purgatory. He just has to keep climbing to get up through the gate and start his journey back to God. But he can't be bothered. He's just sitting there. And they said, well, look, they told me it was going to take a long time, so I'm just going to sit here for a while. Classic Acedia. You don't really have the will. It's purged by zeal. If melancholia is an incurable state, at least Acedia can be defeated. But it's one of the great paradoxes. How do you get rid of Acedia, which is not being bothered, having no will? By getting some will to do something about it. And this is a problem. Because all of the characters who suffer from Acedia in Dante's Purgatorio or in, well, not in the Purgatorio, but in the Inferno or anywhere else, they can't be bothered to do that. They don't want to do anything. They are so afflicted. So how do you do this? Well, we'll see. Yeah. Yes. Please use the mic. Yes.
So Acedia, unlike Melancholia, for example, it's a choice at some point. However, how can it be that it's a choice and at the same time it's an abandonment of will? Mm-hmm.
Great question.
So you just will to abandon will?
You have to recognize that will is a specific thing here. There is God's will, which you could align yourself with, and then there is your own free will. Which, in perfect monastic theology, you align your free will with God's will. If you imagine God's will as a strong wind, then what this means is your will is almost like a sail. You choose to put your sail to the wind, and then you travel with it. Whereas your own free will is like saying, I'm going to use my oars and go against the wind and row my boat in this direction. Maybe you find this depressing, because basically it's saying there's only one way you can travel. Anything else is wrong. You go with the wind.
Anything else is pride.
Yes, precisely. So pride would be understood as I'm going to use my oars and I don't care which way the wind's going. I'm going to get here. And so this is one metaphor to understand it. So for Dante, for example, in Inferno, we see the will in action like this strong breeze, because all of these souls are just rushing into hell. They're just rushing. They can't wait to get on the boat into hell. And Dante says, why are they so excited to get into hell? This is ridiculous. And he says, because that's the will moving, which Dante then equates with love, which is a little bit strange. But anyway, so yes, so this is the problem. With Acedia, you have lost the will, which we might say is any connection with God's will. Maybe you have a will to do something, to row your boat, but I think actually it's the loss of all will. It's just your boat is just floating off into the currents with total abandonment. That's my way of understanding it. It's a complicated problem, though. I think it's not like you're showing a strong will in one direction. It's precisely choosing to not have the will, if you like. Mariam has a clarifying question.
What I feel like is that Acedia, by the way, it's Acedia or Acedia?
I think Acedia is how I would pronounce it, and
okay.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, but Acedia is like a consequence that happens before something else, you know what I mean? It's like we discussed the cause of Acedia, loss of love maybe, and it just feels like Acedia is a state of mind that happens long after something bad happens to you. You know what I mean? It's just like, I'm adding this to Anna's point because I feel like Acedia is a state of mind where you don't have the ability to choose anymore.
Yeah, it's a good point. So if Acedia is, I'll let you look after that again. What's the root cause of Acedia? In other words, is there some event or problem, and then ultimately you choose to respond to it in a certain, by giving up or something? I think it doesn't have to be that way. I think, so yes, on the one hand, we're going to see loads of different explanations for why people get into a state of despair, which is the end point of Acedia, right? But sometimes it's just as simple as I did not want to participate in this good project. Like I stopped believing in my own salvation. So almost the thing that might cause you to have that conclusion is not always the important thing. You know, someone in your life dies, or you spend 24 hours a day in a desert with no friends. These are all good causes. Sometimes there's no cause. Everything's great, as unfortunately I'm sure many of us know from studying depression or knowing people in our lives. Sometimes there's absolutely no reason, is there? You just find yourself in a situation where you don't want to do it anymore. And I think that that's important. It's often actually that's how Acedia is framed. I no longer believe in the thing that's going to make me better. I no longer care about it. Imagine there's some fitness instructor who's telling you you've got to go to the gym every single day. Come on, you're going to win the marathon, the Tumen Marathon. And then one day you think, I just don't care. I don't want to get on the treadmill. I don't want to win the Tumen Marathon, and I don't care anymore. And that's kind of what we're seeing with Acedia. You lose interest in that project. Only instead of the gym and the marathon, it's the salvation of your own soul.
The question, is it really worth it?
Yes. Yes, is it really worth it? I don't want to dwell on it too much because I have a personal fear that sometimes this discussion is contagious. We start asking these questions ourselves. But anyway, okay, let's move on. So what's at the bottom of all of this? I just thought I'd point out that despair is the end point of Acedia, and it is the unforgivable end point. It's unforgivable in Christian theology to despair, to lose hope forever. What does losing hope forever mean? It looks like this woman on the left. This is obviously a depiction of suicide. Let's just see a description of that from Bonaventure, one of the great theologians of the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, his contemporary. A man, or it could be a woman, I don't know why he says man, a person who radically despairs hides themselves, as it were, from the face of divine mercy, as Cain did. Remember, Cain killed Abel. And sin of this kind always has malice conjoined, because he who despairs thus about some sin or other wishes to end his life. Okay, so for Bonaventure, suicide is the end point of all of this. That doesn't need spelling out for us as modern people, does it? Because we know that, unfortunately, the end point of a lot of stories of dejection and despair and depression is suicide too. I thought it was worth pointing out that the Middle Ages has suicide as well, and it has it in abundance. And a lot of it we don't know about, of course, but a lot of it we do. Giotto depicts despair in this way. So you remember Giotto, who for envy had the snake coming back into the eye of the slanderer. For despair, desperatio, we have the hanged woman. This could be a great meme, I'm sure. I don't know how. And this is hope here. Hope reaching out towards. So then again, this is hope reaching out to the prize of winning the Tumen Marathon with all the training, and this is despair saying, I don't want the marathon. I don't want any of it. It's it's a serious issue. It's a serious issue. For medieval theologians, there's no way back. Once you've said, I no longer have any hope, and you commit suicide, for medieval theologians, it's the end of your soul. There's no purgatory. There's no going to the terrace of Sloth and saying, I'm sorry, by running round and around and around. Unfortunately, it's hell. And Dante memorably has the suicides all as trees in hell, which is one of the more perverse episodes, where Virgil says to Dante, who do you think made that sound? Go on, rip that twig off and see what happens. And so he rips the twig off. Ow, says the tree. So you wouldn't have done that if it was a snake. Why do you do it to me? That's what happens. And of course, you remember Judas. Judas couldn't go to hell, couldn't be heaven. He couldn't be saved. He couldn't go through purgatory because he committed suicide. So there's Giotto's spares. Let's hear Hugh of St. Victor on hope, or rather despair. Despair is sadness born from confusion of the mind, or weariness and immoderate bitterness of the spirit, by which spiritual enjoyment is extinguished, and by kind of beginning of desperation, the mind is overthrown within itself. I've just highlighted 3 things there that I find particularly thought-provoking. Confusion rather than distraction there. Confusion. So in Hugh's mind, you're not going to have despair if you've got a really clear mind. Now, I don't understand this because I don't think this applies very well to modern despair, I have to say. Weariness and immoderate bitterness of the spirit, interesting. And then finally, the mind is overthrown within itself. We'll come back to Hugh a little bit later. I just thought I'd say, and I keep mentioning Dante, I know, but it is because he's just so important for the sins. Originally, I thought for this class we'd just have one reading, which would be Purgatorio, and we'd read it all the way through. Maybe we should have done that. Maybe next time. You could do that on the side. I recommend it. But I just thought, when we're talking about despair and all of this, remember I said something about eternal hope coming out of despair, or not quite despair, of sloth, Acedia, of dejection, of losing it, of not wanting to carry on. Well, Dante himself dramatically writes his own life as in this structure of a midlife crisis, of a midpoint in his life where he couldn't be bothered anymore. And then it's the ultimate in unspeakable joy, because he ends up seeing paradise, seeing his dead girlfriend, Beatrice, seeing Bernard of Clairvaux, even better, and then radiating in God's light. That's how the Paradiso ends. And even better, he then goes back to earth to impress everyone by telling them how he's done it and writing the greatest poem ever written. Dante suffered from pride, but he also suffered from sloth, Acedia. And in fact, I think the very first lines of that poem make it really clear. Midway through the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. The whole metaphor, the whole beginning of the Inferno is about a man who is exactly 35 years old. Dante himself, born in 1265, he says it all happens in 1300. For him, that's 70, halfway through his life, midway through the journey of our life, his life. I came to myself. Interesting, in the Italian, retruvere, I found myself again in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Yes, that metaphor of being lost, being in a state of confusion, in the darkness, and not knowing what the point is of course dramatically transformed. So for Dante, in the middle of his the beginnings of his despair, he's found by in fact there are 3 beasts who attack him first, representing 3 of his sins: pride, avarice, and lust. But after that, Virgil appears, Virgil the classical poet, and takes him on his journey. And Virgil says, well, I've been sent by heaven to do this. Now, is it a story about heaven, hell, and purgatory? Or is it also a story about Dante saving himself from his depression, of being ripped out of his depression by a vision of what life is about, of what you shouldn't do, and what the stakes are, and what the joy is waiting at the end of it? For me, that's what makes the poem so wonderful, is it is, as well as being wonderful in all these other ways, it's a journey into one person's psyche, and it's a journey of discovery of the meaning and the point of living, which makes it so vitalizing. Dante describes himself as he goes up Mount Purgatory. Why do I feel lighter all of a sudden? And Virgil says it's because you're purging yourself of all your sins, and he does feel light. He's weightless by the end, circulating around the sun. Okay, so but Dante makes it clear to us that he despises actually this sin of sloth, this problem of not being bothered, throughout the poem. So it's quite interesting. First of all, when he comes, this is before he gets into hell, he actually has some of the worst things to say about the people who didn't even make it into hell. And these people, guys, are the ones who couldn't be bothered. Maybe like some of us, I don't know. I've been there. Dante has nothing but hatred for us people who can't be bothered at some stage to make ourselves known, make it clear what we think about anything. So he has them all ravaged by flies and wasps that just bite them and sting them and give them bleeding faces, and they chase around after this white banner with nothing on it. So they're just chasing after no purpose forever. Dante said, these people, he said, let's not even bother with them. Justice and mercy aren't even interested in them. Nobody's interested in these people, he says. And he says, and the most damning thing, these people who never really were alive. It's really sad. And including one of them you see is actually a pope, Celestine V. But then you see, we come to this question of sloth itself and what it is that drives people to do things, and what it is that causes people problems who can't do anything. And Dante then has the innovative answer of love. Love is the problem. It's a lack of love. The problem with these people is they do not love enough. What does this mean? Here he says in Purgatorio 17, everyone can vaguely apprehend some good in which the mind may find its peace. You can find the good. You know what the good is. We all know that we should do something and why it's good that we do it. With desire, each one of us strives to reach it. With desire, I want to do these good things. I know I should get a nice Mother's Day card for my mother. It's the right thing to do. But if the love that draws you on is laggard, if it's not good enough, if it's a little bit slow, sluggish, defective, to know or have that peace, this terrace, after just remorse, torments you for it. So, and this terrace here he's talking about is the sloth terrace. This is the problem with sloth. You don't have enough love. Un poco amor, he says. That's it. It's too little love. And so you know that you should buy that Mother's Day card for your mother, or even better, make one. It's going to be great. I can just imagine it. It's the right thing to do. She's going to love it. She always feels that she doesn't get enough attention on Mother's Day. But I just can't do it. I can't be bothered. I mean, I do want to do it, but I don't really want to do it. It's that moment when you say, yeah, I should do it. I know I should do it, but I can't. Your love is not strong enough for Dante, and that is the cause of sloth, Acedia. Just very briefly with Aquinas, because we have to end with Aquinas if we're going to talk about these things. And by the way, Dante stole that idea from Aquinas, from his book On Evil. He already said, love is the problem, the deficiency. So it's important. Sloth consists of a boredom or sadness regarding a spiritual interior good. We'll get to boredom later. I just thought I'd make the point that where Dante is unforgiving, you don't have enough love, it's your problem. Aquinas at least gives one escape route, which is maybe the cause of your sloth is not that you've a deficiency of your will. Maybe there's an emotional problem, and maybe you're overcome by grief or you're overcome by some other problem. So at least Aquinas offers a spiritual way out, but of course Dante doesn't. Just briefly to Dr. Freud, just very briefly, because we have to start thinking now about modern applications. What does all of this mean for us thinking about modern phenomena? Can we use a medieval theoretical framework to make anything interesting, speak new in modern texts and the situations we encounter? Here's Dr. Freud, because it's quite interesting. Freud reflected himself on this problem, thinking, of course, he was interested in melancholia and melancholics, in people with all kinds of depressions and repressions. And he considered an analogy with the noonday demon himself. And he made a good point, which was, there's only one difference, he said. There's only one difference. And I wonder what you think about it. In those days, what was thought to be evil spirits to us are base and evil wishes, the derivatives of impulses which have been rejected and repressed. In one respect only, we do not subscribe to this explanation. We have abandoned the projection of them into the outer world, attributing their origin instead to the inner life of the patient. In other words, the only difference is that we now completely seal, Freud says, our sense of where the cause and problem of melancholia and sadness is within an individual. That at least, like Aquinas, but more specifically those who talk about demons, there's this other possibility that you've been afflicted by something psychically from the outside. So that's one interesting distinction. It leads me to just a quick digression on demons, and then we'll get back on track, which is here's a demon precipitating a suicide. You see, again, so there's two parties in the suicide. For Freud's vision of medieval despair, there are two parties. We've seen with Dante and others that there's not two parties. But for Freud's view of it, there are two parties. For Aquinas, there's kind of two parties too. The demon and the individual. I just thought I'd point out that in some versions of medieval law, there's an exception for this. If a man is vexed by the devil and can do nothing but run hither and thither and kills himself, it is permitted that prayers be offered for him if he was previously pious. So this is the only time where you can be excused for your suicide or your despair, if it can be proven that there was a devil or a demon. Where does all of this leave us in terms of medieval thought on Acadia? Once again, we see the multiplicity of agents. Some say demons, some say your own inner doubts, some say it's just a lack of love. All of these, I hope, will be useful thinking ahead. But I feel that it's time to move on. I feel that, I get that sense of Acadia just creeping in for some of you. So let's move on, and there's some video clips. Let's move on to World-Weariness. Let's move on to one of the great enigmatic, melancholic figures in literature, Hamlet, Shakespeare's play, written around about 1600. There's a lot to say about Hamlet in terms of melancholia. He himself is inert. He cannot do the thing that he's supposed to do. He does eventually, but he cannot do the thing. He cannot kill his uncle. He cannot avenge his father, even though his father's ghost has appeared to him and said, do it, Hamlet. He was poisoned. His uncle had poured poison in his father's ear, and now Hamlet needs to take revenge. But instead of taking the revenge, he reflects, what is revenge? What's the point of the revenge? At one point, he holds the skull of Yorick and says, well, Yorick's reminding me that we're all going to die anyway, and what is this? What is this life for? Why bother to take the revenge? So there's a lot of this in action. Is Hamlet depressed, or is he pretending to be depressed? Well, I want to show you two versions of one of the most famous speeches from that play. You know the speech, what a piece of work is a man, and so on. It ends with, what to me is this quintessence of dust. So let's look at two versions. One of them is from the 1990s. It's Kenneth Branagh. He's the guy who we saw doing Othello. I think he's currently in the movie theatre with Christopher Nolan's movie. He plays a Russian in it, apparently with a bad accent. I don't know. He's one of our great Shakespearean actors. But anyway, so look at Branagh doing Hamlet's Misery and Melancholia, and then we'll look at Richard E. Grant doing it. I hope there's a huge contrast. I want you to think about which one you prefer. I want you to think about which one you think communicates medieval Acadia better and why.
I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercise, and indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof, fretted with golden fire. Why, it appeareth no other thing to me but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapours. What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust?
Okay, so that's Kenneth Branagh in the 90s doing it. And let's be clear, that's he's done that in the period. He's trying to be fairly accurate to Shakespeare's time and place. Now let's look at Richard E. Grant. This is from a movie. I think it's a little bit earlier than that, called With Nail and I. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's a great movie about inertia. Actually, it's about two actors who are just bored and drunk, and they don't really do anything. But let's have a look at Richard E. Grant's speech.
I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth. And indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory.
It's the most excellent canopy, the air. Look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire. Why, it appeareth nothing to me but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapours. What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god! The beauty of the world, paragon of animals. Yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me. No, nor women neither. No women neither.
Okay, so two very different versions. I should just give you some small context, which is that Withnail and I, the second, this is about two actors, and that actor, the character Withnail, always talks about how he should play the Dane. You know, he should have been given the break where he could play Hamlet on stage. So, of course, he's giving his big speech. Right, well, we have a microphone just here. I'd just be interested to know some comments on the differences between these two, what they tell us about melancholy. What kind of versions of Acedia do we see? Do we see any medieval elements in either of them? As I scurry among you, I'm going to wear this mask. Okay. Okay, who would like to go first? I'll just choose the most melancholic looking person if no one volunteers. It's probably not fair. Nikita, you're definitely not the most melancholic.
Okay, I personally suppose that the second version is more about medieval Acedia or melancholy, because this like character is like he really hates the situation. It's like it's obvious, and he shows it to no one but for himself. And while in the first, actually, it was not really like good with the sound of his voice, because, and that's why I like lost a couple of words of him, of the first actor. But still, he is more like calm and patient, and it seems it's more like modern version of depression, of melancholy. Like, okay, it's a very bad situation, and I'm like disgusted with it, and yeah, I think the second one is more medieval, at least for me.
Okay, interesting. Okay, do you want to pass to the next person? Yes, at the back. Great.
Well, I would like to disagree, probably, because I feel like in the second way of acting, there's zeal, there's passion, a bit of passion, and therefore it feels like there's a bit of will, like you want to act somehow, maybe not want to act, but there is something inside you, and I think it contradicts, like some passion inside you, and it contradicts with the understanding of sloth, or how I understand it.
So, in a sense, the Richard E. Grant version is more anger, or some other, or envy,
probably.
possibly, more likely. Interesting. Yes, other comments?
I would say that the second person is more like a crying for help. He's poisoned by his sin, he poisons himself with alcohol, and he's just maybe angry that he cannot get away from it. While the first example, well, he looks inspired by this melancholy. He's not, I'm not really sure that it's appropriate to say, but it looks like he's not taking his Acedia seriously. I mean, he's really lighthearted about it. He's just, well, it doesn't feel like it's a really deep problem for him.
The second one, or the first one?
The first one.
The first one doesn't seem like it's a really deep problem.
Yeah, and the second one looks like he's crying for help.
Yes. I suppose if one of these was your relative, which one would you worry about more? It would be a good entry question here. I'd worry about both. I think the kind of worry I would have if Kenneth Branagh turned up at my house and made that speech in that way. But it's serious. I'm serious, of course, that there's a dimension of melancholy which is being shown, or world-weariness, or depression, that's being shown in Hamlet by Branagh. And I wonder if it's something precisely to do with that doesn't seem so bothered. Is it all just a joke to Branagh? Like, he's leading these two guys, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, around, and he's doing this show for them. I don't know if any of you, I hope none of you have ever been at a low point in your life where you just go through the motions and you start to almost mock a situation that you're in because you can't be bothered. I hope that's never happened to any of you. But for me, Branagh seems to be, that element seems to be coming here of it's all a joke, life has no meaning, and I'm just making this speech to you like, the paragon of animals. But then we get the serious. If you do think he's not taking it seriously, that quintessence of dust, he stopped looking at them, he stopped the playing, the larks. Look, he's transfixed. I feel that there's some movement within that speech where by the end we get quite a serious and very, very dark sense of nothing. That's just what I feel. Other comments, anyone?
When you say a sense of nothing, do you mean that hole in the heart that was depicted earlier?
Do I mean the hole in the heart that we mentioned earlier? Well, what do you think? I mean, can you see a hole in Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet's heart? Do you see a hole in the heart of Richard E. Grant? Would Dante say of both of these that, yes, they've lost the love, not enough love? I think it's interesting that with Richard E. Grant, right, you could make a good argument, and I think to agree with Nikita's point, you could make a good argument that actually all the sins have, if we say that, like Gregory the Great did, that all the sins build one on the other, so you have pride, then envy, then anger, then Acedia. Well, with Richard E. Grant, we see the accumulation of the other three. Pride, he should be playing the Dane. Envy of the others. Anger, he's angry about it. And then, of course, what's the point? They're never going to choose me to be Hamlet, so I'll just go and give the speech to these zoo animals in the rain. I think it's actually quite a good 1, 2, 3 sloth, concatenation. So by that logic, he's going to become avaricious, gluttonous, and then lusty by the end of the film, which, good reading in the film. Is there a hole in Branagh's heart? Is there a hole in Hamlet's heart? It's obviously not a question for right now, but the argument could be made. It's too little love, that he cannot do the thing. He loves his father, but maybe not enough to avenge. Is that the argument about Hamlet? It would be a good one. It would be a good paper, wouldn't it? It would be a good essay. Okay, so, great speech. I love that speech. The whole play can be read through the eyes of Acedia. A couple of things that it might tell us. Notice the association with genius or with a certain kind of intellectual flair and ability. Hamlet's speech is, one of the greatest flights in the English language. Does it get more exuberant than that? This majestic roof fretted with golden fire, the paragon of animals, the beauty of the world, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god. It's strong language, great rhetorical language. There's a great intellect beneath it, we feel, or within it. And is that an interesting part? Is that an interesting question to look at, the question of depression, boredom, Acedia, from? Do you get there by being a genius? There's a lot of theories about that in studies, that a certain kind of thought process can lead you to a standstill. You think, you can't do anything anymore. Or is it that, or maybe you think without acting and that paralyzes your action. So that's one interesting angle, the relationship between the intellect, the outstanding intellect, and depression. It could be one you look at. With Grant, I suppose intoxication is an interesting aspect, and bitterness. We haven't really talked about bitterness, but we should move on. Let's move on to the very difficult question of depression. I've shamelessly ripped this from one of the Sin portfolios. One or two of the Sloth pieces that you handed in just this last weekend dealt with depression and specifically dealt with this movie, Melancholia. It's Lars von Trier, isn't it? And it's a horrifying movie. If those of you who haven't seen it, it's about a planet that's coming to crashing to Earth, so all of life will be annihilated. Conversely, through this coming crisis, Kirsten Dunst's figure kind of finds herself out of her depression into some kind of serenity, and she's the one who keeps everyone together. Really interesting, really terrifying film, I have to say. Nightmarish situation. I'm not going to say too much about depression. I'm just going to say two things. One of them is I'm going to look at how it's medicalized and treated as a medical problem within the body, very briefly, because it's an interesting angle that we haven't explored enough in medieval Acadia. We spotted like the melancholy humour theory. Might be interesting to look at modern theories of depression in the body. And then just something really brief about clinical and philosophical approaches to depression. So not too much to say. I do think there's a lot of parallels with medieval Acadia and depression. I think it's a valid parallel to draw. Having looked at it from many angles, I think it's perfectly valid. I think it actually helps us understand. The question, does depression have a history? There's a long question about this, and like there's an argument, boredom and depression are like an Enlightenment affliction. As the Western world becomes more obsessed with the individual, with happiness as a goal in life, loses its metaphysical structure in terms of secularizing, no longer believing in God. There's a big argument, depression comes from this kind of loss of meaning. But I think you'll agree that this is a reductive and absurd argument historically, in the sense that what else are we seeing discussed in Dante than, if we can't call it depression, then what kind of intellectual work can we do about the past? Can we never understand anything they talk about in modern terms? I think that depression is a decent enough word to get us started in understanding Dante and the suicides and the midlife crisis and Sloth as any other. Helen Mayberg is interesting. This is someone who is hotly in demand among people who suffer from clinical and chronic depression. There are certain situations, right? So I'm sure you're aware that people who suffer from depression, there are a number of treatment options for them. And one of them is tablets, right? Certain kinds of medication which are apparently extremely effective, and a lot of them go straight to receptors in the brain that deal with things like serotonin and other things, right? So there are certain clinical treatments that are quite targeted and that work quite well in many cases. There are certain therapeutic methods that work quite well. CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, teaching people to think about their problems in a broader way, or to rethinking their problems, or escaping from certain thought habits that can be quite destructive to the self. Like, I'll never do this because I'm awful, and I'm awful because I'll never do this, and so on. People can get stuck in a rut, and so there are certain talk-through therapies which can help people escape that rut through chatting. But there is another layer beyond which these treatments do not seem to be working, of people with chronic and clinical depression. And of course, this is a very sensitive area, and I know that we all unfortunately have people in our lives, perhaps, who have this problem. So I understand some of you may be very sensitive about this. I certainly am myself. But apparently there is a treatment offered by Helen Mayberg, who is a neuroscientist, which is seen as something like the last resort treatment. This involves the stimulation of the brain of an individual who is suffering from depression. Now, this is in a case where all the other therapies have not worked, and it's been a long, long time. Andrew Solomon, the writer, who I'll talk about in a moment, describes a case of somebody who, a university student, had a quite successful life, and then suddenly had a depressive syndrome when driving, and did not escape it for sort of 20 years. And so we're talking about people who've been through a lot of depression. They end up at Helen Mayberg's door. And what is this treatment? And it's just interesting to think about the medicalization of this Acadia process. It's hard to imagine one of our medieval monks under this tent, but it is the stimulation of the brain by an electrode, specifically a part of the brain. I'm going to show an image here, which is this. Now, this has to be done while the patient is conscious. So it's open skull therapy while conscious. So it's a serious business. If someone finds themselves sitting in that chair, it was a pretty serious depressive situation. And it's an area, mysteriously enough, known as Area 25 in the brain. Now, by all accounts, stimulating that part with electricity solves the problem for a lot of people who couldn't have it solved in any other way. 20 years of suffering from depression. One patient, again, this is taken from Andrew Solomon, who described this. One patient described it as like, the electrode went on. The person had no way of knowing whether the electrode had been turned on or not, but suddenly said, what did you do? I feel like you've just taken all of the weight out of my life. So apparently this is one way. Now, how do we understand that as people grappling with a problem like medieval sin and Acadia? I don't know. But it's interesting to think that at some level there is some hard biological answer. But it's still mysterious to us. What does it mean an electrode stimulates region 25 in the brain? What does that mean? We don't understand enough about the brain to know what this means. For all we know, region 25 could be about cabbage consumption and processing the chemicals. We don't know. It could one day lead us to say, yes, and you know what? Galen was right. Cabbage consumption is the root of melancholy. So let's not think that we're superior to Galen just yet. But what we do know is that some energy in some mysterious lump of tissue in our skull can change depression. It's just interesting to think about, isn't it? Andrew Solomon, I've mentioned him a few times. Let's have a look at him. He has a wonderful book called The Noonday Demon, which was published 20 years ago. It's interesting to see how he describes it, because he's someone who's, on the one hand, grappled with depression himself in a serious way in his own life and in the life of his loved ones. But also he's someone who's written about it from a philosophical and psychological point of view. And it's interesting to see some parallels with medieval ideas of Acadia. Depression is the flaw in love. To be creatures who love, we must be creatures who can despair at what we lose. And depression is the mechanism of that despair. What would Dante say about that? I think Dante would find that fascinating. If Dante said that love was the force that moved all of the universe and all the stars and that caused all sins through either our bad reaction to it or our perversion of it, then this might make him think, okay, so it's an interesting counter idea. And it reminds us, doesn't it, I suppose, of the defense of anger that was made by Seneca the Younger, which was, you can't be kind if you can't also be angry. You have to be angry to be kind as well. Well, if you're going to love, you must also have the ability to lose love. You must be able to feel the absence of love. So it's quite an interesting view of this. Solomon also writes, here's a long passage from the Noonday Demon. And I think this is interesting because it gets at this thing we're going to touch on for our final part of the lecture, which is that enigmatic, unspeakable joy. The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. Oh, Dante would totally agree, totally agree. It's exactly right. Getting the life force in you, that's the difference. And my life, as I write this, is vital even when sad. Interesting point. I may wake up sometime next year without my mind again. It is not likely to stick around all the time. Meanwhile, however, I have discovered what I would have to call a soul. A part of myself I could never have imagined until one day, 7 years ago, when the hell came to pay me a surprise visit. It's a precious discovery. So, let us encounter this problem for the last part of the lecture. Could it possibly be, unthinkable as it is, that in a moment of deep Acadia lies the root of some spiritual awakening? Could Acadia be not just a problematic sin, but rather also in some cases an opportunity to recreate the soul or to find the soul? I don't know what Dante or Thomas Aquinas or Hugh of St. Victor or any of the other medieval theologians, Cassian, would think about this. I think that some of them might entertain it. After all, Dante seems to see his own midlife crisis as the springboard for his awakening. There's at least the hint of that reading there. Aquinas even entertains the idea that your will intervene to save you from your emotive episode of Acadia. So this is the final part of the lecture, to encounter this enigmatic joy through boredom or through emptiness or depression. Let's look at boredom. You may yawn now. There is some evidence that if you look at someone yawning, or even, you can... But of course with the face masks, I can't see you yawning. It's so perfect. You're all free to yawn as much as you like. There's one over there. All right, boredom. Here's a wonderful painting of boredom. William Orpen's Bloomsbury Family in 1907. Can't you just feel it? Can't you just feel the inescapable misery? We've all been in these situations, usually on a Sunday. usually somewhere like where the table is right up to your chest and you just can't escape, even if you wanted to. Maybe you've already had 7 cups of tea, and you're offered one more and there's no escape, and the table is full of cakes that you didn't want in the first place. Look, boredom can strike in different ways. There's a wonderful book called Boredom, A Lively History, which I recommend, by Peter Toohey, published in 2011. That's a great read, and he mentions and has a quick discussion of this painting. Another thing Toohey mentions, which I find fascinating to just begin our discussion of boredom, is it can be found through this. This is Robert Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions, the wheel of the 8 emotions, which we could explore in all kinds of ways. But let's just focus down on this one part of the wheel where we see loathing. If we just focus down on that, you'll see boredom is just here on this petal. Notice its proximity to disgust and loathing. And as one writer, William Ian Miller, has said, boredom stands in relation to disgust as annoyance does to anger. I'm not going to spend some time talking about this. I just want to throw it out there to you because I do not fully understand it. What is the relationship between boredom and disgust? Why is it here for Plutchik? We could have some theories. One is, and I think this is the idea that Plutchik has and that Toohey talks about, which is that actually boredom is like our first defense mechanism against something toxic that's going to hurt us. So if the lecture has been going on for an hour and 15 minutes and you're bored, it's your first defense against this disgust, which is, I don't know what the disgust is, that you can't cope anymore, that you're going to be trapped, that there's no way out of this boring situation. I think that's one for you to think about yourself, but do remember we saw that discussed a little bit earlier with Cassian. Okay, but to understand boredom, we need to look at someone, a heavyweight who has looked at boredom thoroughly. So let's turn to Heidegger. For those of you who are bored now, as I say, it is almost over. We are almost there. We are so close. We can almost touch the end of that lecture. Heidegger wrote about boredom because he was fascinated about being. Heidegger wanted to understand, what is our being? What does it mean to be a human being? Like, what do we experience when we just are being? Do we understand that thing of being? So he's really probing your own experience at its most intimate level. And of course, Being and Time is the great book. But it's the Fundamentals of Metaphysics, the lecture series where he discusses boredom. I'm not a Heidegger expert. I don't know too much about it. Sadly, Professor Anmol Hall is no longer here, but she was a Heidegger. I remember finding her copy of Being in Time, and like every page has 20 annotations. It really scared me, actually. But so any of you who can write her a message, she can answer this. I can't, but I do know about boredom just from reading the Fundamentals of Metaphysics briefly. Heidegger, fascinatingly, has 3 levels of boredom. All right, three kinds of boredom, which he labels, and they're kind of strange labels. Heidegger is very difficult to translate anyway. Into German is the joke, let alone into any other language. But being bored by something, being bored with something, and it is boring for one. So these apparently are the 3 levels of boredom. I guarantee that all of you have felt numbers 1 and 2, even today, possibly. Number 3 is more serious. So, being bored by something. This one is easy. This one is what you feel right now. A particular thing is boring you. And it's quite simple. There's a situation, not even a situation, a thing. Like a lecturer who speaks too long without planning his timings properly, and you get bored by the topic. Or, it's a movie that's not going very far. Roma, I didn't enjoy that movie, I have to say. I think it was probably a very good movie, which is why I didn't enjoy it, because I've got no taste. But that bored me. I sat there and I looked at the watch, and I got the phone out. These situations are easy. They're not that interesting, right? You're just in a situation that bores you. You're gonna be out of that situation. You won't be bored anymore. You're gonna leave the lecture, this room, in 7 minutes' time, and you won't be bored anymore. It's over. So that's okay. That's superficial boredom. The next one's more serious. Being bored with something. This is where your existence is temporarily transformed into dead time. What does this mean? So, Heidegger gives the example of going to a dinner party, and this is quite unusual. All right, so the idea is that you go to an event like a dinner party or a conference or anything, and you have a decent time, you know, you're laughing in the right places, you know, you're joining in the conversation, you're maybe playing a game, you know, whatever. We must chat again later, good to see you, and then you leave. And this is when you realize later that, in fact, the situation itself had bored you. It's a reflection of, well, actually, the situation, I wasn't conscious of it necessarily in the moment. I was able to distract myself, but actually I was bored. So maybe, for example, you had a weekend, maybe you live alone, you had a weekend, you did loads of things, you watched loads of movies, you did some lecture preparation, but you realise on Monday that actually it was a boring weekend. I have to tell you, it was a dull weekend. It's this kind of situation where you realise that that time, you had been living that time, you'd been distracting yourself in that time, you weren't conscious of your boredom, but actually it turns out it was dead time. You were only filling time. There's that Radiohead song, called, what is it called? True Love Waits. There's a lovely line in it, you know, I'm not living, I'm just killing time. It's a horrible line, isn't it? Yeah, it's kind of that situation. You know, the more melodramatic of songwriters like Tom York might say something terrible like, you know, it was never living, it was always killing time. Dante, with his, these people were never really alive at all. I think he might be accusing them of exactly this. So that's being bored with something. You can see that it's a lot more serious, isn't it? It sucks you in a little bit. But it's not the most profound kind of boredom. The most profound kind of boredom is, it is boring for one. This is how it's translated. It is boring for one. Notice the passive, the one, the depersonalization. Okay, so this situation is where your entire temporal horizon now stretches out indefinitely, rendering everything equally indifferent. I hope this doesn't describe anyone's life. I'm really sorry. This is a situation where everything is boring. It doesn't matter what happens, your life is boring. It doesn't matter what it is. Pete, it's really amazing. I've got tickets. We're going to see Tumen FC play. They're playing Omsk at the weekend. And like, you should be excited, but, you know, it's really just nothing. It's a whole lot of nothing that's coming. It's going to be, I don't care. It could be the best match. It could be 27 goals apiece. And it's going to be boring for me because my temporal horizon is nothing but stretching out infinite nothing of indifference. So this is a very serious situation. I think you'll agree that this sounds a lot like depression. But I wonder if it's dangerous to conflate the two, to say that this is depression might be to, you know, to miss something in the nature of depression. But anyway, so that's it, your entire temporal horizon stretching out indefinitely. So 3 kinds of boredom for Heidegger. But the interesting thing here, and this is where if you're, again, you'll have to email Professor Mulhall to explain Dasein, Heidegger's idea of being, because it's strange, it's peculiar to me. It's not boring for me, but it is peculiar for one. But Heidegger talks about a certain ecstatic potential within this profound boredom. Only in the resolute self-disclosure of Dasein to itself, in the moment of vision, does it make use of that which properly makes it possible, namely time as the moment of vision itself. You see now why it's impossible to read Heidegger on your own, and you need Professor Mulhall's annotations. Mysteriously, enigmatically, through this Fundamentals of Metaphysics, this lecture series, Heidegger raises the possibility that in that moment of total, profound meaninglessness in your life, the boredom where everything stretches out into nothing, you become conscious of being itself, of what it is to be. You are nothing but being, right? You're not distracted. For the first time in your life, you're really alive at some level in this moment of total boredom because you grasp the simplicity of being. I think this is how I understand it. And in that moment, God, I hope one of my friends who's a Heidegger expert isn't watching, Todd Foley, if you are. Hello, Todd, correct me in the comments. But if in this moment, right, of pure being, of undifferentiated being, maybe you glimpse Dasein, which is, for Heidegger, this process of seizing your life, of entering with a vital agency, of becoming a self-realizing, self-actualizing being. Which is what? And this is where it's problematic, because we all know that Heidegger became a member of the Nazi Party in 1933, 1934, and so on. So look, there are problems here. But From what I understand, it is a vital realization of a possibility of realizing your life, of seizing hold of what is, to make yourself a meaningful life, to make your life meaningful, to make yourself an agent, to find some being, some vital being in the world, to participate, to have vitality, can come through this total reflection of nothingness. Maybe because you clear all of the other distractions out of the way. Maybe when nothing matters to you. I don't care if Tumen are playing a football match. I don't care if it's ice skating, Disney. I don't care. It's all meaningless to me. Maybe all of the other distractions are gone and you see life for what it is, and then you see how you can make a difference, where you can find meaning. That's how I understand it anyway. I think that he gets carried away with the idea, to say the least, and I think it's probably one of the more dangerous ideas if you take it to its final conclusion. But still, it's worth bearing in mind. And it is worth bearing in mind, isn't it, that at the bottom of the worst depression, at the bottom of Acedia, for some thinkers comes this profound joy, whether it be for Dante in the vision of Beatrice, his lover and God, or whether it be something more like seizing the day, seizing the moment, seizing yourself for Heidegger. It's stupid of me to carry on at this point because that's a good endpoint for a lecture, but I'm in a difficult situation that I have a clicker with 6 more slides, and also I want to get to the end, so I'm going to just really quickly and in a detached and slightly incompetent way run through Stuplimity by Sian Nagai, which is an idea which those of you who did my humour class, which is I think none of you, 3 of you, 1 of you, some of you, 1 of you, Arseni, you're the only one. Okay, so you can hide behind your laptop. Okay, Stuplimity, really quickly. This is just an interesting idea of boredom that might apply slightly more directly to our own lives. She is a wonderful cultural critic. I forget, is it Northwestern in Chicago, possibly? Stuplimity is the aesthetic experience in which astonishment is paradoxically united with boredom. It's another theory of boredom. I try to understand this stuplimity. So basically, you're shocked by something, but you're also bored by it. Like, you see something on the internet, and you think, my God, how long did that take to make? It's amazing, and yet it bores me somewhere deep inside. Does this make sense to any of you? Like, I don't spend enough time on the internet. And the only thing I could think of, as some fading away, kind of not young anymore person, the only thing I could think of was like someone who made Hogwarts or, elaborately on some video game program. Like, it's amazing the amount of time they put in. It does strike me with awe. But when I think about the fact that it's just a load of blocks that someone dragged around on a screen, it also strikes me with an immense amount of futility and boredom. But maybe that's just being cruel. Anyway, I have to be honest with you, stuplimity is an idea that I still am yet to have my aha revelation moment with. But it's worth checking out. Instead of emerging from existential or phenomenological questions or acts of exaggerating the banality of consumer culture, this boredom, stuplimity, resides in relentless attention to the finite and small, the bits and scraps floating in the common muck of language. So you see how detached that was. I should have just left it with Heidegger. It was a big uplifting end. Now, why we have like some stupid Minecraft Hogwarts and everything's lost. But this is good, this is good. It's like when you're playing in music, it's great to have like some stupid notes at the end and then, everyone doesn't have to clap. All right, so final questions then. Final questions to think about. As we go off in our afternoons and we think about the medieval material, as we reflect on our own deep, profound, equally boring lives, hopefully not, some questions. First of all, what tensions do we observe between fighting, overcoming, curing, and accepting Acedia? That's an important question, isn't it? We've seen through all of these different authors, right? Some of them talk about it's a combat, you fight Acedia, it's something you can fight with and overcome. Some people talk about overcoming it, like superseding it or whatever, coming out the other side, reincorporating it into our lives. Some talk about curing it. It can be cured for some, right? Again, Galen would be the obvious example. And then accepting Acedia. Is there a position in all of these thought for just accepting that sometimes you can live with a depressing or boring life and it's okay? Must it always be a sin? Next up, several writers imagine a type of joy is following Acedia. How far are they comparable? Can we really talk, as I've tried to do, across these different genres and different ideas of joy? Can we really talk across them and connect them? Is there something that connects, like that design of Heidegger, to Dante's vision of God, or to Cassian, remember, talked about it's followed by an unspeakable joy? Can we talk about those in connection? Is it fair to do it, or is it missing something important? And finally, can Cassian's idea of Acedia as deserting a duty be connected with modern boredom or depression? That was, I said at the start of the lecture, one of the more troubling, provocative questions. But I think you've seen throughout there is a strong connection between neglecting some duty that you have to the other, to yourself, and melancholia. Hamlet neglecting his duty, if you like, to avenge his father. The monk neglecting their duty to be monks, good monks, and to be in the world in that way. And of course, Heidegger talking about boredom as neglecting your duty to be an active, realizing agent in the world. Okay, guys, enjoy your afternoon. No Acedia for any of you, no sluggishness, I hope, and we'll all see each other again to discuss concrete medieval examples. Look at that, it's exactly an hour and a half. What time is it? 7?